There is a photograph that Graham Munsell had never seen. A tank driving away from a mushroom cloud in the South Australian desert. The cloud still climbing, the tank intact, the engine running, the registration number visible on the hull, 169041. Munsell had commanded that tank through 8 months in Vietnam. He had named it. He had ordered it driven forward 30 minutes after a Soviet rocket punched through its hull, because the situation required it, and that was what you did. He had trusted it with his life, and with the lives of every man who served beside him. He had crawled over every inch of it during maintenance checks and learned to read its moods the way a stockman reads weather. He had no idea what it had survived before he ever climbed into the commander's hatch. The man who found the photograph was Barry Hodges, Munsell's driver, years after the war ended. He turned a page in a military history publication and stopped. He looked at the registration number in the photograph, and then he looked again. He put the book down and picked up the phone. I thought, "Bloody hell," Hodges said when he described the moment in later years. "I'll never forget it." He called Munsell, his old crew commander, the man who had given the tank its name. When the confirmation came back that what Hodges was looking at was real, neither of them said anything for a moment. This is the story of the tank they called Sweet Fanny, and of every Australian soldier who ever sat inside it. It is a story about a machine, but it is more than that. It is the story of the men who drove a nuclear test survivor to war without knowing what it had survived, who kept it operational through ambushes and village battles and 2 years of grinding attrition, and who spent the last chapter of their lives making sure the record was set straight. Before you watch this, tell me in the comments, did you know that Australian tank crews served in Vietnam? Because what you are about to hear is a story your history books missed, and it belongs to real men whose names deserve to be said aloud. Graham Munsell grew up in Mirrabooka, Western Australia, in the kind of suburb that produces men who are good with their hands and do not talk about it. He was the product of a working household where machinery was respected and maintained, and not treated as something other people dealt with. By the time he joined the Royal Australian Armoured Corps, he had already developed the practical intelligence that separates the soldiers who understand their equipment from the soldiers who merely operate it. He was not the kind of young man who struggled with institutional life. He understood structure and used it, but he also understood that structure was the frame and not the picture, and that what happened inside the frame was the responsibility of the individuals who showed up to it. He took his training seriously. He asked questions of the senior crew commanders who had been through the regiment longer than he had, and he listened to what they said, and he applied what was useful and discarded what was not. By the time he reached his mid-20s, he was the kind of soldier that a unit quietly builds around, reliable, technically sound, and able to make a decision under noise and smoke when the decision needed making. The Centurion responded to that kind of attention. It was a complex machine, and it rewarded the crews who took the time to know it. By the time Munsell reached Vietnam in February of 1969 with B Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, he had spent years learning it from the inside out. He knew the weight distribution across the suspension and what it meant when the vehicle began to pull left on a straight road. He knew the cold start sequence, the sounds of the transmission under load, the specific vibration that preceded a track problem. He knew the turret drive, the ammunition stowage, the gunnery procedures at different ranges in different conditions. He was 24 years old, and he knew his machine. The conditions that B Squadron found when it arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in February of 1969 were not conditions that any training in the temperate climate of Pukapunyal had adequately prepared them for. The heat was the first thing, the kind of heat that sits inside a sealed vehicle and climbs until it is no longer uncomfortable but dangerous. The humidity compounded it. The fighting compartment of a buttoned-up Centurion on a hot day in Phuoc Tuy province reached temperatures that degraded crew function within 15 minutes, and so the hatches stayed open, and the tank commanders and loaders stood with their heads and shoulders above the armor line that was supposed to protect them. They stayed exposed because a tank commander who cannot see cannot fight, and a tank that cannot fight is not worth the cost of the men inside it. This was the calculation that every crew commander in Phuoc Tuy had made and continued to make every day, and it was the correct calculation, and it meant that when the enemy fired at the tanks, the men most likely to be hit were the men with their heads above the steel. Munsell had made the calculation and accepted its terms before the first month was out. 2-4. Charlie was his vehicle, his crew, his responsibility, and he was not going to command it blind to protect himself. When B Squadron unloaded at Vung Tau and rolled off the landing craft onto Vietnamese soil, Munsell was assigned to serial number 169041. He had its call sign within days, 2-4 Charlie. He had its nickname within weeks, Sweet Fanny. The name was irreverent in the specifically Australian way, which is to say it was the opposite of what it sounded like. You named something Sweet Fanny because it mattered to you and you had decided to stop pretending otherwise. You gave it the kind of name that held affection at its center and let the irreverence be the wrapping, because in the culture Munsell came from, direct sentiment was something you dressed carefully before you sent it out in public. He described the tank in later interviews with the vocabulary of a man talking about a colleague rather than a machine. It had character. It had preferences. It responded to certain handling in ways that a crew learned to anticipate, and it communicated its condition through sounds and responses that took time to learn and repaid the learning. The other crew members in B Squadron knew that Munsell understood his vehicle better than most. It was not discussed. It was simply evident in the way 2-4 Charlie was always where it was supposed to be and the way its maintenance was always current. What Munsell did not know, sitting in his commander's cupola for the first time in a Vietnamese landscape, was that serial number 169041 had been manufactured at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Barnbow in 1951, had arrived in Australia in late May of 1952 with fewer than 500 miles on its odometer, and had been selected less than a year later for one of the most extraordinary military experiments in Australian history. In October of 1953, the British government conducted a nuclear weapons test series at Emu Field in the South Australian desert, under the direction of Sir William Penny, the physicist who had observed the Trinity test in New Mexico and the Nagasaki bombing, and had spent the years since building Britain's independent nuclear deterrent. The test series was called Operation Totem. Its purpose was to establish the acceptable limits of plutonium-240 contamination in a bomb design. But it was also an opportunity to answer a question that every military planner in the Western Alliance was asking in the 1950s. Could a tank survive an atomic detonation? The arms race was accelerating. The bomb was real. The generals who had invested billions in armored doctrine needed to know whether that doctrine had any relevance in a nuclear exchange, or whether it was simply very expensive kindling. To answer the question, the British and Australian governments selected a specific vehicle from the inventory of the 1st Armoured Regiment at Pukapunyal in Victoria. A Centurion, barely used, representing the frontline tank in Australian service. Serial number 169041 was loaded onto rail transport and sent into the desert. The journey covered 1,242 miles from Pukapunyal to Emu Field. Rail to the railhead, then a heavy transporter across 300 miles of desert tracks that repeatedly defeated the trailer on its own, requiring the Centurion to be dismounted and used to winch the transporter through sand dunes and dry creek crossings. The last 170 miles were driven under the tank's own power, its Rolls-Royce Meteor engine turning over in the cold Australian winter air as the hull crossed terrain that no armored vehicle had crossed before, and very few people had either. Somewhere on that journey, the men driving and escorting it may have understood that they were doing something unusual. They did not know the full shape of what they were transporting toward, or the full shape of what would be asked of them when the experiment was over. When the tank arrived at Emu Field, the preparation team worked through a careful and entirely cold process. A full ammunition complement was loaded into the ready racks. Instruments and sensors were fixed to the exterior and interior surfaces. A mannequin crew of 4 was positioned at every station, each figure fitted with radiation film badges, the chemical packets that accumulated a record of ionizing radiation exposure over time. The engine was set to idle. The hatches were sealed from outside. The brakes were released. The turret was turned to face the steel test tower, and the tank was positioned at its assigned distance from the base of that tower. Approximately 400 meters, less than 500 yards. The test director was Sir William Penny. His team had calculated what a 9 to 10 kiloton device would do to military equipment at various distances. The Centurion's placement was deliberate, close enough to produce damage data that was meaningful, far enough that the vehicle might survive in a recognizable form. The calculation was correct in the narrowest possible sense, and it was performed without the slightest concern for what the experiment would require of the men who would have to approach the vehicle afterward. At 7 in the morning on October 15th, 1953, Operation Totem 1 fired. The yield was between 9 and 10 kilotons, roughly 2/3 the destructive energy that had destroyed Hiroshima 8 years earlier. At 400 meters from the tower, the thermal pulse arrived at the speed of light, roughly a millionth of a second after detonation. The visible flash was brighter than the midday sun. Then the fireball, expanding outward, temperatures at its core measured in millions of degrees. Then the shockwave, traveling at several times the speed of sound, carrying overpressure that collapses most unprotected structures and turns the atmosphere briefly into something that behaves less like air and more like water. The Centurion moved 5 feet backward. Its side plates were torn free and thrown 200 yards from the hull. The antennae were stripped to their bases. The optical periscopes were sand-blasted to opacity by the debris in the shockwave. The mantelet cover was incinerated in the thermal pulse. The engine stopped, not from blast damage, but because the fuel had run dry in the preparation phase, and no one had noticed before the device fired. The machine that had just faced an atomic bomb had been defeated by an empty fuel tank. When Penny's team read the radiation badges recovered from the mannequin crew, the numbers required no interpretation. A real crew inside that vehicle at that distance would have received a lethal radiation dose. Sick within hours, dead within days. The experiment had answered its central question with clinical precision. The hull survived. The crew would not have. 3 days after the detonation, while the crater at the base of the tower was still warm and the desert floor was still measurably contaminated, 4 men arrived at the test site to recover the vehicle. Their names were not recorded in the formal documentation of Operation Totem. The movement orders that would have identified them did not list them. They wore standard military uniforms. They had no dosimetry equipment. They were told to recover the tank, and they did. They climbed into it, introduced auxiliary fuel, started the engine, and drove it back across the desert toward Woomera. The engine threw a connecting rod somewhere on the return journey, the blast's mechanical effects finally asserting themselves in the crankcase, and they loaded the tank back onto the transporter, now running on blown tires, and dragged it the remaining distance to the decontamination facility. Who those 4 men were is a question that the official record cannot answer. The movement orders that would have named them were absent when the 1985 Royal Commission on British Nuclear Tests in Australia went looking for them. The commission confirmed that personnel who handled contaminated equipment from the British tests in South Australia faced a statistically elevated risk of cancer compared to the general population. It confirmed the elevated risk as a category. It could not confirm the individuals because the individuals had been removed from the paperwork before anyone foresaw that the paperwork would one day be needed as evidence. All 4 men died in the following decades. The causes were consistent with what the commission had confirmed. Their families know who they were. The official record has nothing to say. The contamination those 4 men carried in the vehicle with them was not hypothetical. The tank was measurably radioactive. The dust coating its exterior contained fallout particles from the detonation column. The air inside the fighting compartment, sealed at detonation and then exchanged with the post-blast atmosphere during recovery operations, carried residual contamination. The men worked in it, breathed in it, and drove through it for several days. They were not warned about the risk. The paperwork was structured to ensure that the risk could never be connected to their names, because their names were not in the paperwork. This was not an accident. It was a decision. The same test that irradiated those 4 men produced a second consequence that received no official acknowledgement for 30 years. The detonation column generated a dispersal of fallout that the test planners had not modeled for inhabited ground. A low, rolling dark cloud that eyewitnesses called a black mist moved south from MU Field after the detonation. It traveled 175 kilometers across the desert to Wallatina Station, where approximately 45 people from the Yankunytja Jara Aboriginal community were caught in it. They were not warned. The official planning of Operation Totem had proceeded on the assumption that the surrounding land was uninhabited, because acknowledging habitation would have required either relocating the people who lived there or choosing a different test site, and neither option was as convenient as simply deciding the land was empty. The community fell ill. Adults experienced nausea and skin effects. Children were affected. The contamination was real, documented by later investigators, and denied by official sources for 3 decades. The 1985 Royal Commission confirmed what those 45 people had known since October of 1953. The tank returned to Pukapunyal by late 1953 and was placed under armed guard. Soldiers with fixed bayonets were posted around it around the clock. Personnel were instructed to park it far from the main lines and not to approach it without authorization. The institution had been returned a vehicle it did not know how to explain, and it responded with the characteristic solution: guard it, classify the information, tell no one. The turret was removed. A tow hook was fitted in its place. Serial number 169041 was demoted to the regiment's tow vehicle, dragging broken equipment off training ranges and out of mud. A new engine was installed in 1956. A base overhaul in 1958. Mark V standard in 1960. Storage. Then, in 1962, quietly returned to active service as a training vehicle, assigned to young soldiers who operated its controls and ate their lunches in its shadow, with no awareness of what the steel around them had absorbed a decade before. Meanwhile, a war was growing on the other side of the world that would eventually come looking for this particular hull. Australia committed advisors to South Vietnam in 1962 and combat troops in 1965. By 1966, the Australian task force had established its base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, a roughly county-sized piece of South Vietnam, bounded by mountains, rubber plantations, and coastline, containing a communist infrastructure that had been resisting foreign occupiers for 20 years. The task force's initial armor commitment was M113 armored personnel carriers, 12-ton aluminum vehicles built to carry infantry under fire and cross paddy fields without bridging. The M113 was a useful machine. It was not a tank. Its armor stopped small arms fire. It could not reliably stop a rocket-propelled grenade. And the forces the Australians were fighting in Phuoc Tuy Province had rocket-propelled grenades in quantity, used by men who had been studying how to kill armored vehicles since before most of the Australian soldiers in the province were born. The gap between what the M113 was designed to do and what it was being asked to do became a casualty count in February of 1967. Operation Bribey sent M113s in a direct assault role against prepared North Vietnamese positions southeast of the Nui Ti Vai Hills. 8 Australians were killed and 27 were wounded. The men who died in those aluminum vehicles had done nothing wrong. Their training was sound. Their decisions under fire were correct. They died because the machine they were given was the wrong one for what it was being asked to do, and the institution had not yet acknowledged that clearly enough to change it. 3 weeks later, Operation Renmark produced 7 more killed and 26 wounded. 34 Australian casualties in 31 days from armored vehicles the Armored Corps had always categorized as personnel carriers, employed as assault vehicles because there was nothing else available. The decision to send Centurion tanks to Vietnam was announced on September 6, 1967. Critics in the Parliament argued that a 52-ton vehicle designed for Northern Europe had no tactical relevance in the paddy fields and rubber plantations of South Vietnam. The bridges could not take the weight. The terrain would immobilize them. These arguments were made by people with genuine expertise and genuine conviction, and they were wrong, but only combat would prove it. The tanks were modified for the climate and the conditions and sent. C Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, sailed from Sydney in February of 1968. On the morning of departure, the Royal Australian Armoured Corps Orchestra assembled at the dock and played Waltzing Matilda as the squadron marched past their families. It was a ceremony designed to give people something formal to hold on to before the informality of what was coming. The crews were young men, trained and fit, and carrying the weight of knowing that the M113s had already proven the cost of inadequate armor, and that they were going to try something different with a vehicle that the institution believed in, even if some people in the Parliament did not. 24 Centurions rolled off the landing craft at Vung Tau on February 24, 1968. Barry Hodges came from Gol Gol, near Mildura, a river town in western New South Wales where a man either learns to work with machinery or does not stay. He was a driver by training and by temperament, which meant he understood machines from the inside rather than the outside. He felt what the vehicle was doing before the rest of the crew could fully register it. When the Centurion was running well, Hodges knew it in his hands. When it was struggling, he felt it first in the controls and passed the information upward before the gauges confirmed it. He described the Centurion with genuine admiration, and with the specific admiration of a man who has been around enough machines to know the difference between one that is merely competent and one that is genuinely well made. State of the art in its time. The stabilized gunnery system, still impressive by 1969 standards, giving the gunner a first-shot accuracy that other vehicles in theater could not match. The Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, a 12-cylinder design derived from the Merlin that had powered the Spitfire. Magnificent in 1945 and a genuine fuel challenge in the operational conditions of Phuoc Tuy province. 4 gallons per mile on good ground, 7 or 8 in thick mud. The external 100-gallon fuel tank, fitted as a Vietnam modification, lasted less than 15 miles in hard going. The crews in the field adapted everything that the factory had not anticipated. The side skirts designed to deflect RPG rounds were removed entirely because in the mud of Phuoc Tuy, they became traps that slowed the vehicle and clogged the running gear. Spare track links were welded to the glacis plate as improvised armor, extra steel on the front face where the threat was most likely to arrive. The infrared night fighting lamp was stripped because the jungle canopy absorbed the beam at 4 meters and made it useless. Ammunition carriers were welded to the exterior of the turret. The vehicle that arrived in Vietnam in early 1968 and the vehicle that fought through 1969 were the same hull, carrying a different tactical philosophy developed entirely by the men who lived inside it. The test of that philosophy came at Coral Balmoral in May of 1968, when the North Vietnamese Army launched its May Offensive and the Australian Task Force established fire support bases, Coral and Balmoral, northeast of Saigon. The bases were established in a hurry, with security gaps that experienced NVA regulars from the 7th and 272nd Regiments found on the night of May 12th and came through. They penetrated the perimeter at FSB Coral. They overran a gun position. They got inside the wire. The Centurions were 120 kilometers away at Nui Dat. The officer who changed that was Colonel Donald Dunstan, temporarily in command of the 1st Australian Task Force in Brigadier Ron Hughes's absence. Dunstan looked at the situation map, looked at his infantry in contact more than 100 kilometers away, looked at his tanks with cold engines at the base, and issued the order immediately. His explanation afterward was that he could not see any reason why the tanks should not be there. That was the complete explanation. It was sufficient. C Squadron marched 120 kilometers through a Vietnamese night, losing one armored bulldozer to a mine on the approach. The crews arrived tired, in position, and ready. When the NVA's 141st Regiment attacked FSB Balmoral in the pre-dawn hours of May 24th, it met Centurions moving in darkness, firing in darkness, absorbing RPG hits and keeping going, driving over bunkers, firing canister rounds at infantry assaults that had closed to within meters of the Australian positions. The rounds struck the hulls, the armor held, not because the RPGs had failed to function, but because the Centurion steel was thick enough to absorb the hollow charge jet before it reached the crew compartment or the ammunition. The assault collapsed in 30 minutes on the night of May 28th. 55 enemy soldiers died in that single engagement. By the time Coral Balmoral was finished in early June, 267 North Vietnamese soldiers from the 141st and 165th Regiments were confirmed killed. 25 Australians were dead. Approximately 100 were wounded. The infantry companies that had fought at Coral and Balmoral had done so alongside Centurions that were there because one officer had made one decision quickly and correctly. The men who had watched those tanks absorb RPG rounds that would have destroyed an M113, who had watched them move forward of the perimeter into the darkness to engage the positions that were pinning the Australians down, who had used them as cover and as direct fire support at ranges that would have required artillery support otherwise, came back from that battle with a specific and personal understanding of what the tanks meant. It was not abstract. It was the memory of being in a specific position, in a specific darkness, with a specific weapon that was trying to kill you. And then the tanks were there, and then the position was suppressed. It was the memory of the men beside you who were alive, because the tanks were in front of them. That was the verdict that mattered, not the staff assessment and not the after-action report, and not the parliamentary debate. The verdict that mattered was the infantry soldier who had been at FSB Balmoral on the nights of May 24th and May 28th, and who, when asked whether the Centurions should have been sent to Vietnam, answered without hesitation. The infantry that had come to Vietnam skeptical of heavy armor delivered its verdict in 4 words, worth their weight in gold. The argument that had run through the Parliament and the defense planning committees and the editorial pages was settled not by rhetoric, but by 55 enemy soldiers who died in 30 minutes because the weapon they were attacking did not fall down. C Squadron continued operations through the remainder of 1968, and B Squadron rotated in during February of 1969. Among the Centurions that unloaded at Vung Tau with that second squadron was Sweet Fanny, freshly overhauled, its nuclear history as invisible as it had been since 1953. Munsell and his crew spent their first 3 months in Phuoc Tuy Province, building the accumulated confidence that comes not from the absence of risk, but from the management of it. Contacts, mine incidents, long road marches, and the grinding daily maintenance that kept a 52-ton machine functional in tropical conditions. The crew had developed the specific trust that forms between people who have depended on each other under pressure and survived it. They knew their jobs. They knew the tank. They knew each other. On May 7, 1969, Munsell's troop was moving through an area classified amber. Contact possible, but not expected. The standard language for a route the enemy used, but had not recently actively contested. Another tank in the troop triggered a mine. The blast threw track and destroyed the vehicle's running gear, and in the disruption of noise and motion and tactical reorganization that followed, the ambush that had been waiting for exactly that moment was launched. The RPG that struck 2-4. Charlie hit the left side of the hull between the track and the running board. It was the shot geometry specified in the RPG gunner's training for attacking a Centurion, aimed at the point of thinnest effective armor at that angle. The hollow charge warhead functioned as designed. The copper liner collapsed into a jet of superplastic metal that punched through the hull steel and entered the fighting compartment. The jet traveled diagonally. Entry lower left through the floor space, lodged upper right rear corner. The ready-round ammunition bins were on the right side of the turret. The jet stopped inches from them. 3 more inches, and it would have struck the propellant charges of the main gun's ready rounds. The cook-off would have been immediate and total. Every man in the turret would have died before any of them could register what was happening. The difference between the crew of 2-4, Charlie surviving May 7th, and not surviving, was the angle of entry of a warhead, fired by a man who was doing his best to kill them, and the geometry of a fighting compartment drawn up by engineers at Barnbow, who had no knowledge that their calculations would one day be tested in a Vietnamese jungle against a weapon designed in the Soviet Union. Munsell described the moment years later with the quietness of a man who has had a long time to absorb what it means. The loudest experience I've ever heard, followed by the most deathly silence. Electrical systems shorted. Smoke filled the turret. Fire at the entry point. His gunner. "We're on fire. We've got to get out." Trooper Carter had taken fragmentation wounds to his legs and feet. He was evacuated. Munsell and the remaining crew stayed with the vehicle, controlled the fire, and assessed the damage. In the hours after the contact, Munsell wrote his report and ensured his vehicle was assessed by the unit's mechanics and confirmed the nature of the damage and organized Carter's evacuation properly through the chain that existed for exactly this kind of outcome. He did these things in sequence and without excessive commentary because this was what a crew commander did after a contact. The unit needed accurate information. Carter needed the right care. The tank needed to be assessed. Munsell did all three before he permitted himself to sit quietly for a few minutes in the commander's seat of a vehicle that had 2 holes in it, entry and lodgement, and think about what had been in the space between them. He did not say much about those few minutes afterward. He said that the tank had done its job and his crew had done their jobs, and that was the correct assessment of what had happened. He drove 2-4 Charlie into the vehicle park, noted the fuel state and the track tension and the oil pressure, and submitted his report. 30 minutes after the RPG struck, they had started the engine and driven on. A hole in the left side of the hull, 2-4 Charlie operational, the crew in it. The tank that had stood 400 meters from a 9 to 10 kiloton atomic detonation 16 years earlier had just survived a direct RPG hit that should have killed everyone inside it, and not one person on that vehicle had any awareness of the first fact. They drove on because the situation required driving on. That was all. Barry Hodges joined the crew days later as Trooper Carter's replacement. He took the driver's seat in a vehicle with a patched entry hole in its left side and settled in with the practicality of a man who has never seen the point of dramatizing things that are already dramatic enough. He and Munsell worked out their professional understanding quickly, the way experienced people do, through the 100 small interactions that constitute real knowledge of a person under pressure. What Munsell would do when a contact developed. What Hodges needed to know and when. The specific communication between a crew commander and a driver that operates below the level of formal instruction and above the level of instinct, in the space where a crew becomes something more reliable than the sum of its parts. Hodges took his seat in the driver's compartment of serial number 169041 and began, without knowing it, the 8 months that would define both of their lives. At Bin Ba, 5 kilometers north of Nui Dat, on Route 2 in Phuoc Tuy Province, the war arrived at its defining moment for B Squadron. Before the evening of June 5, 1969, Bin Ba was what Australian War Memorial historian Ashley Ekins later described as an idyllic little place. Whitewashed houses with terracotta roof tiles, surrounded by a large rubber plantation. A village where Australian soldiers had played soccer with the local children in the preceding months of the deployment and bought produce from the market stalls along the main street. Australian servicemen had sat with the village elders and drank tea and tried their few words of Vietnamese on the children who gathered to watch them. The rubber trees cast the kind of shade that makes a place seem removed from the world's urgencies. The village looked like a place that the war had missed. On the evening of June 5th, the People's Army of Vietnam's 33rd Regiment moved into Binh Ba. They came with elements of the D-440 Provincial Mobile Battalion and local Viet Cong units, and they occupied the buildings throughout the village, established firing positions in houses and behind garden walls, and in the rubber trees at the perimeter, prepared ambush positions along the main route through the center. They had studied the previous Centurion engagements in Phuoc Tuy Province. They knew which shots had worked in February. They had planned their defense around specific vulnerabilities that they had identified in previous contacts, and they waited for the morning. The Australian intelligence assessment the following day put the enemy presence at platoon strength, approximately 30 to 40 men. The actual strength was several hundred soldiers from multiple units, prepared throughout every building in the village. It was the kind of intelligence failure that has ended military careers and destroyed operations since intelligence became a function of warfare. On the morning of June 6th, it would cost the life of a 20-year-old soldier named Wayne Teeling. At 8 in the morning, a Centurion and an armored recovery vehicle from B Squadron moving north on Route 2 past Binh Ba were engaged from within the village. An RPG-7 round penetrated the Centurion's turret and severely wounded at least one crew member. The amber classification became red. Major Murray Blake assembled the Ready Reaction Force. He was a professional officer who understood that the arithmetic of the force he had available versus the force he was going into was unfavorable, and he committed his men anyway because the alternative was leaving Binh Ba to the enemy, and the consequences of that were not acceptable to him as a soldier or a commander. Blake had D Company, 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 65 men, below established strength from the accumulated attrition of the deployment. A composite troop of Centurions from B Squadron, M113 APCs, and their crews from 3rd Cavalry. The 105th Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery, on call fire. Well under 200 Australians going into a prepared enemy position in a built-up area. Blake understood the disparity. He went in anyway. At 11:20 on the morning of June 6th, the force entered Binh Ba from the south. Second Lieutenant Brian Sullivan commanded the composite Centurion troop. He was 23 years old and had established himself across the preceding months as an officer whose judgment under pressure was faster and clearer than his rank might have suggested. He was not the kind of officer who waited for the situation to resolve itself. In February, when the lead tank was disabled by 3 RPG hits and the crew was wounded, and the RPG crew that had done it was still in position, Sullivan had dismounted from his own vehicle, moved to the disabled tank under fire, suppressed the RPG crew with his personal weapon, and extracted the wounded men. A pistol against anti-tank rockets. Approximately 60 seconds from the decision to the extraction. Then back in the turret, back on the radio, and the operation continued. The action was noted in the after-action report and was considered unremarkable by the standards of what Sullivan's troop dealt with regularly. He pushed 4 Centurions into the main street of Binh Ba. The enemy had positioned RPG-7 crews in firing positions throughout the village, prepared for exactly this approach. Within 1 hour of the Australians entering Binh Ba, 3 of Sullivan's 4 assault tanks were disabled. Track links blown, running gear destroyed. In one case, a penetration through the turret ring area. 3 vehicles immobilized. their crews still inside, still fighting. None of the disabled tanks had been penetrated in the hull. The armor had protected the men inside it, even as the vehicles themselves were being rendered immobile, piece by piece. The Centurion was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, which was keep the men inside it alive in conditions that would kill them without it. And the men inside were doing exactly what soldiers do when their vehicle is broken, but their weapons are not. They kept fighting. Sullivan's own moment came without warning. The RPG was fired from close range, close enough that the propellant was still burning when the round passed him. He had developed, in the preceding months, the reflexes of a man who has survived several near misses and understands them as information rather than simply as fear. When his peripheral vision caught the smoke trail, he dropped behind the turret ring before the conscious decision had fully formed. The tail fin of the round grazed across his shoulder blade, sliced through his shirt, and detonated against the wall approximately 2 meters behind his position. He stood back up, assessed his situation, and transmitted his status to Major Blake in the tone of a man who has decided that alarm is not a useful contribution to what the next 30 seconds require. In Tank 21, Charlie, Trooper Roy Dodd, and Trooper Ray Collins were fighting a vehicle that had absorbed multiple RPG impacts and was still operational. Dodd was 23 years old and from Hobart, Tasmania. He had a wife and a child at home who did not know yet that their husband and father was in a burning village in South Vietnam. Collins was 21 years old, from Queensland. He had been in country for 5 months and had already developed the specific competence of a soldier who has moved beyond training and into the lived knowledge that training can only point toward. The two men had been crewing together long enough to understand each other's rhythms. They did not need to discuss what to do in 21 Charlie on the morning of June 6th. They knew. The Centurion's armor had stopped every RPG-7 round that had struck their hull. The design that the critics had called wrong for Vietnam was, in the fighting compartment of Tank 21 Charlie on June 6, 1969, doing exactly what the people who built it had designed it to do. In the years and decades after Bin Ba, Dodd and Collins spoke about each other with the vocabulary of men who understand that surviving something terrible together creates a form of connection that no subsequent distance or time can dissolve. Collins eventually arrived at the summary: 2 blokes in the wrong place at the right time. It took him 30 years to find the right words, and when he found them, they were exactly right. Private Wayne Teeling was 20 years old, from Victoria. He had been in Vietnam for 12 days. Bin Ba was his first engagement, the first time he had been in contact with an enemy that was genuinely trying to kill him, rather than an instructor who was pretending to. He had done everything his training required. He had arrived at his position under fire, and he had stayed at it. He was killed on June 6, 1969. 12 days is not enough time to accumulate the biographical detail that war histories typically require to justify a sustained mention. He does not have the story that Dodd and Collins have, the decades of friendship and the eventual summary, because he did not have the decades. He was 20 years old, and it was his first action, and he died in it. And his name belongs in this story as fully as any name here, because the measure of a soldier is not the length of his service, but the seriousness with which he showed up. Major Blake pivoted the attack. 3 tanks disabled, the direct approach channeled into killing zones. He swung the surviving armor and infantry left through the rubber plantation to the southern edge of the village. In the plantation, the formation encountered an NVA company assembling for a counterattack in the open ground between the rubber trees, caught in column without cover and without knowledge of what was coming toward them. Centurions in open ground against exposed infantry without anti-tank support is not a battle. It is the end of one. The fighting continued into June 7th. Duc Trung, a smaller hamlet adjacent to Bin Ba, was cleared by infantry and armor in the close quarters cooperation that the task force had made its operational standard across 2 years in Phuoc Tuy. The 105th Battery fired missions throughout both days, including the fire mission that stabilized a South Vietnamese regional force unit on the eastern approach that would not have survived without the guns. By June 8th, the last organized resistance was suppressed, and the civil affairs teams were moving through damaged streets with food and water for the people who were still there. The cost at Bin Ba: 1 Australian killed, 10 wounded, 4 tanks damaged. Wayne Teeling, 20 years old, 12 days in country. The majority of the Australian wounded were tank crew members struck while standing exposed in their turrets because they had made the correct calculation that seeing the threat was worth the risk of being seen by it, and that calculation had cost them what it cost, and they had stayed anyway. The enemy cost: 99 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed, the majority from the 33rd NVA Regiment. The regiment never returned to Phuoc Tuy province in force. The task force's after-action report described the Centurions at Bin Ba as a battle-winning factor. Sullivan received the military medal for his conduct. Blake received a commendation. The 2 years that followed Bin Ba were quieter in the accounts and no less dangerous in practice. Mines were the constant adversary. No crew, no warning, no respect for armor thickness, just a pressure plate and a weight. The regiment adapted continuously. A squadron under Major Jack Chipman rotated in during December of 1969. Operation Hammersley in February of 1970 put the full squadron against a major communist base complex in the Long High Hills, the heaviest sustained fighting since Bin Ba. Multiple RPG strikes across the operation. Losses limited to wounded. The vehicles that took multiple hits and kept fighting in those hills became the specific evidence of what Australian armor maintenance discipline, built over 2 years of incremental learning and field modification, had actually produced. When the last Australian Centurions loaded at Vung Tau in September of 1971, the numbers were there for anyone who wanted to understand what had been accomplished. 58 tanks in total, 42 with battle damage of varying severity, 6 rendered beyond local repair, 2 crewmen killed in action, in a war that had already killed more than 400 Australians in total, in a role in which nearly 3/4 of the deployed vehicles had been struck by enemy weapons. 2 tank crewmen died in action. The design that the parliamentary critics had called wrong for Vietnam had protected the men inside it with a thoroughness that the critics had specifically argued was impossible. 3 battle honors: Coral Balmoral, Bin Ba, Hat Ditch. Lieutenant Bruce Cameron, 22 years old, commanded the last Australian tank troop in action in Vietnam and received the Military Cross for his conduct in those final operations. His troop drove to the dock, loaded the tanks, and sailed. The men who came home from the Centurion deployment came home as men who had proved something important in a way that no argument had previously been able to prove. They had taken a vehicle that the critics had specifically nominated as wrong for the terrain and wrong for the war, and they had made it work, not through equipment modifications alone, but through the kind of continuous adaptive intelligence that only soldiers who are genuinely invested in keeping themselves and their mates alive can sustain across a full deployment. The field modifications to the Centurion that Australian crews developed in Phu Quoc province were not in any manual that had been written before the deployment began. They were written by the men who were there, in the language of solutions to specific problems that had specific costs if they went unsolved. Sweet Fanny came home in that shipment. Its records noted Vietnam service, the standard configuration, the maintenance history. They noted nothing about the South Australian desert. Nothing about October 15th, 1953. Nothing about the 4 men who had driven it home from a nuclear test site in standard uniforms without dosimetry equipment and died of cancer in the following decades without their names appearing in any document that survived. The institution had filed all of that exactly where it wanted it. The Centurion was replaced by the Leopard 1 in 1977. The last parade at Pukapunyal on November the 20th, 1976, was not a large ceremony. The Vietnam veterans who attended had spent 5 years learning that the country had complicated feelings about their service, and that the most available response to that complication was a form of institutional silence. Sweet Fanny, serial number 169041, passed into the museum inventory of the 1st Armoured Regiment at RAAF Base Edinburgh in South Australia. Its real history sat elsewhere. Munsell went home to Western Australia. Hodges returned to Gol Gol. They stayed in contact, as men do after they have shared something that resists the usual language of description. Then Barry Hodges turned a page. He was reading a military history publication when he found the photograph. A Centurion tank driving away from the column of a nuclear detonation in the Australian desert. The registration number was visible in the image. The number was 169041. I thought, bloody hell, I'll never forget it. He called Munsell. His old crew commander had not heard about the nuclear test, had no knowledge of it at all. The regiment at Edinburgh, when the question was raised through informal channels, had no record connecting the vehicle to Operation Totem, because the connection had never appeared in any document the regiment maintained. The institutional memory had been severed so cleanly that the people responsible for preserving the tank did not know what they were preserving. The 1985 Royal Commission had already established the broader context. Personnel who handled contaminated equipment from the British nuclear tests in South Australia faced a statistically elevated risk of cancer. The movement orders for the Emu Field recovery crews were missing. The 4 men who drove serial number 169041 back from the test site could not be identified in the formal paperwork because the formal paperwork had not identified them. The Commission confirmed the elevated risk as a category. It could not confirm the names. The names had been removed from the story before anyone foresaw that the story would one day require them as evidence. All 4 men died in the following decades, of causes consistent with what the Commission had confirmed. They died without a document connecting what they had done to what was killing them. Their names are the most important missing detail in this story, and they are still missing. This is the specific shape of what institutional silence does to individuals. It does not erase them immediately or dramatically. It simply stops writing their names down at the moment when writing their names down becomes inconvenient, and then it waits, because institutions are patient in ways that individual human lives are not, and eventually the men die, and the opportunity to find them closes. The 1985 Royal Commission found the outline of the problem and could not fill it in, because the filling in required names that were no longer in any accessible record. 32 years had passed between the test and the commission. The 4 men had lived and died in that gap. The commission arrived too late to save them, and just early enough to confirm that they had needed saving. Hodges spent years doing what the institution had declined to do, and he did it with the specific thoroughness of a man who has always understood that the work you do not do does not do itself. He began by contacting former crew members, officers who had commanded the regiment during the relevant periods, archivists at the Australian War Memorial, historians who had written about the British nuclear tests in Australia. He found what could be found and noted carefully what could not be found, because the gaps in a record are as informative as its contents when you understand what should be there. He corresponded with Munsell throughout, comparing what each of them remembered against what the documents confirmed and what the documents conspicuously omitted. He compiled a 50-page documented history of serial number 169041, its manufacture at Barnbow in 1951, its delivery to Australia, the classified orders, the test at Emu Field, the recovery, the tow vehicle years, the Vietnam deployment, the May 7th ambush, Bin Ba, every crew rotation, every named man who had sat at every station across nearly 2 decades of service. He worked through archives and personal accounts and regimental records with the thoroughness of a man who understands that the alternative to his effort is that the record simply does not exist. In 2018, Hodges and Munsell donated money from their own pockets to commission a commemorative plaque for the tank at RAAF Base Edinburgh. The plaque gives the complete biography: Royal Ordnance Factory Barnbow, 1951. Operation Totem, Emu Field, October 1953. C Squadron and B Squadron, Vietnam, 1968 through 1969. Sweet Fanny, the atomic tank, RAAF Base. Edinburgh sits close to the road that the recovery team followed in the winter of 1953, driving a radioactive tank home in blown tires with a failed engine, and 4 men whose names were not in the orders. The same road, different decades. The desert unchanged. Munsell described what he and Hodges had uncovered with the precision of a man who has thought about a thing for a long time and arrived at the sentence that does not overstate it. It is the only known tank to go under a nuclear blast, be rebuilt, and go back into active service and to be penetrated. He paused. Then, I hope the history goes on and on. Munsell was in his 70s when the plaque was fitted, an old man who had spent most of his adult life knowing exactly what he had done in Vietnam, and very little of the preceding decade knowing what the machine he had done it in had been before he climbed into it. He stood in front of the tank at Edinburgh after the plaque was fitted and looked at what Hodges had compiled, the documented record of everything serial number 169041 had been and done across more than 2 decades of service. And he said that he hoped the history would go on and on. He meant it. He is the kind of man who means what he says and says only what he means. And when he said he hoped the history would go on and on, what he was expressing was not pride in the machine, although the pride was there, but something more specific. The hope that the men who had crewed the machine at each stage of its history, including the 4 whose names are still missing, would be remembered as what they were. Australian soldiers who did their jobs in conditions that the institution that sent them did not always acknowledge honestly, who kept the machines running and the crews alive, and the record of what they had done available for anyone willing to look for it. The history goes on because they made it go on, not the institution, not the official record. Two men with their own money and their own years of patient work, who decided that the silence was not acceptable and that a bronze plate attached to a piece of steel was a form of defiance that paperwork could not undo. This is a story about a tank. But it is more precisely a story about what happens to the men around a tank when the institution that sent them decides it is more convenient not to record their presence. The four unnamed soldiers who drove serial number 169041 back from Emu Field in October of 1953 were Australian soldiers. They wore standard uniforms. They had no dosimetry equipment. They did the job they were ordered to do. They were never officially recorded as having done it. And they died with the connection between that job and their deaths unacknowledged in any surviving document. Their names are still missing. They are still waiting for someone to find them. The crews of C Squadron who proved the critics wrong at Coral Balmoral, who marched 120 kilometers through a Vietnamese night because Donald Dunstan could not see any reason why they should not be there, who fired their guns in darkness at assault lines that had been told the fire base was lightly defended, were Australian soldiers. The hundreds of named and unnamed men across B Squadron and A Squadron who were struck by weapons designed to kill them and survived because of the combined effect of good design and the kind of maintenance that only comes from soldiers who genuinely understand what they are maintaining, were Australian soldiers. Brian Sullivan, who dropped behind his turret ring a half second before a tail fin crossed his shoulder and stood back up and keyed his radio and reported his status in the tone of a man for whom alarm was not a useful contribution to the next 30 seconds, was an Australian soldier. Roy Dodd, 23 years old from Hobart with a wife and a child at home, was an Australian soldier. Ray Collins, 21 years old from Queensland, two blokes in the wrong place at the right time, was an Australian soldier. Wayne Teeling, 20 years old, 12 days in country, first action, was an Australian soldier, and his name belongs here as much as any other. Murray Blake, who understood the arithmetic going into Bin Ba and committed his 65 men anyway because the alternative was not acceptable, was an Australian soldier. Donald Dunstan, who could not see any reason why the tanks should not be there, and said so and meant it, was an Australian soldier. Graham Munsell, 24 years old from Mirrabooka, who named a tank Sweet Fanny and drove it through 8 months of Phuoc Tui province and ordered it forward 30 minutes after a rocket punched through its hull because the situation required it, was an Australian soldier. Barry Hodges from Gol Gol, who sat in the driver's compartment of that hull for 8 months without knowing what the steel around him had already survived, who found a photograph years later and made a phone call and then spent years building the record that the institution had declined to build, was an Australian soldier. The tank is at RAAF Base Edinburgh. The plaque is attached. The names that could be found are on it. The names that could not be found are still somewhere in a classified filing system, still waiting. Sweet Fanny survived an atomic bomb because of steel and distance and calculations made correctly by engineers who did not know they were saving men who had not yet been born to crew it. It survived Vietnam because Graham Munsell and Barry Hodges and Roy Dodd and Ray Collins and Brian Sullivan and Wayne Teeling and Murray Blake and Donald Dunstan and every other man who ever sat in its hull or commanded from its turret or walked beside it in the dark, maintained it, fought it, and refused to abandon it when the fighting was at its worst. The story survived because Barry Hodges turned a page and recognized a number, and because he understood that finding it meant he had work to do. That is not a small thing. In the history of how we remember the Australians who went to war, The decisions made by individuals who refuse to let the record go cold are not small things. They are the whole thing. The institution that sent these men to MU Field and to Vietnam and to every other place where Australian soldiers have been sent had the resources and the authority to keep the record straight. It chose, at specific moments, not to. The men who filled the gap that the institution left did so with their own time and their own money and the specific stubbornness of people who have decided that something matters and are not going to stop saying so. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. Tell me the names of Australian soldiers you think history has forgotten. Because there are more of them than you know, and they are still waiting for someone to turn the page.